Okay, so today's lecture is on transhumanism. Last time I talked about a Christian approach or towards a Christian literary theory, and I didn't get far enough to my own satisfaction to present it as it was, in part because I need to account for what's going to happen in this lecture, what I'm going to discuss in this lecture, and what I will discuss in the next lecture, which is on posthumanism. And the challenge of a Christian approach to literary theory is the main challenges come from transhumanism and posthumanism, in my opinion. And they are not as they are popularly being presented right now in the academy from postmodernism, which you will hear in Christian circles and in conservative circles, that the challenges are from postmodernism. And you'll hear Jordan Peterson railing against postmodernism and the ills that have come from the academy, and you'll hear me do the same thing. But that's very much old hat, because postmodernism stopped being a thing in the academy, as in lit theory, almost 25 years ago. So that's how far out of date the conservatives are, and the evangelicals are, and Christians are, in terms of engaging with the culture. So when I say stop being a thing, it's being talked about in popular venues, like on conservative websites. They'll talk about postmodernism, and they'll get a lot of traction because it explains the total irrationalism they see all around them, because postmodernism is committed to an attack on meaning, an attack on reason, attacking on normativity, an attack on colonialism, all the things that I've cataloged thus far. Those are there, and they remain catch-all phrases. So colonialism is the catch-all for whiteness and European and toxic masculinity. Colonialism probably pulls all those things along with it, and it suspends appeals to reason and ideas of reason, debate, and let's look at the evidence and so forth. The colonialism and what I talked about when I talked about critical race theory really does dispute the idea that we can reason our way forward and come to a better understanding collectively, because the sides have been positioned such that the very appeal to reason is considered a power move according to an illegitimate criteria, and is on the playing field of the establishment, at least the establishment of the past. And Foucault very much supported that when he talked about a different episteme, and the episteme that he wanted to promote was that which would flip the script, as it were, and stop assuming that the establishment view of human nature was actually valid, when in Foucault's opinion it arose in the 19th century. And he discusses that in The Order of Things and the Archaeology of Knowledge and elsewhere. It's in his work on the development of the prison, discipline and punishment. It's in his History of Sexuality, where he talks about the idea of heterosexuality as opposed to homosexuality which only is a term in the mid-19th century. So he talks about all of these things as recent consequences of the human sciences, which are not only questionable, but are solely based around power and oppression. And as I said to you when I talked about Foucault, Foucault has an inordinate influence in the academy. But that would just put him in the postmodernist camp, and not really account for something that we see that has been influential in the academy for the last 25 years. As I say, nobody talks about postmodernism in the academy. Nobody. Only in conservative circles do they talk about it, as if this were the problem, when if you're on the cutting edge of this in the universities, you're seeing that nobody's talking about it. What are they talking about? Well, they are talking about intersectionalities, for sure, in the education square, very much so, and inclusion and diversity and, tolerance and those sorts of things. And they do have the pantheistic consequences that I've talked about already. They effectively, if you include everything as mere information, then you can't differentiate good and evil. The very concepts of good and evil are rational distinctions, linguistic distinctions that words lack the ability to actually grasp and are effectively meaningless. They are themselves a power play. So we move from a black and white to a 50 shades of gray approach, and all shades of grayness are good, and we get varieties of different human identities that arise from that context. This is not a problem of postmodernism, however. It's a problem of transhumanism, because transhumanism is a project that has a genuine project that it's trying to achieve. Whereas I would say that all of the varieties of lit theory that I talked about that characterize the 20th century, lit theories in general, are anti-humanist. That's what I said describe them. They're anti-humanist. They dispute that there is such a thing as human nature, and they're opposed to it. And they do it through identity group approaches. They do it through attacks on the word, being at war with the word. We looked at the R.V. Young's work there. So they either attack the person or they attack the word as their general approach. But that's not what we confront now. We see a very positive agenda being rolled out for us. The negative doesn't go away. They will still use those forms of attack against their opponents. So they'll attack the idea of human nature, they'll attack human reasoning, etc. And those are I admit, postmodernists in their flavor. But the positive agenda is represented by transhumanism. And transhumanism, it's going to take me some time to get into this and show you the consequences of it. But let me talk about the consequences a little bit more specifically, and then I'll come back to them, and at which point I think it'll make more sense. But the consequences of transhumanism are to dispute the moral nature of humanity and the idea that freedom is important to human nature. Those two things. And transhumanists are in the target sites of C.S. Lewis in his science fiction work. They're in the, it's there in The Abolition of Man. In chapter 3, where he talks about the abolition of man, he's talking about the transhumanists. It's there in That Hideous Strength. It's actually even before that, but specifically in That Hideous Strength, when he is talking about the NICE and its agenda for gaining control over human nature. It's a project that is in the university of his day, and it's there from a variety of vantage points. There are scientists there, there are religious figures, there are capitalists on board, there are politicians, there are propagandists, newspaper writers, there are sociologists. Mark Studek has been brought in on board because he's a very good writer. He doesn't care, they don't care about his sociology, they care about his writing skills, because he's on board with them, broadly speaking, in their view of human nature, which is a view of human nature of the human sciences. Not the humanities, the human sciences. His wife, on the other hand, very interestingly, is a humanities scholar doing a dissertation, a PhD on love. So there's a war between the humanities and the human sciences within the very marriage there, and Mark is being pulled away from her, that is his wife, by the NICE. But Lewis is talking about the challenge or the threat of transhumanism there in his work. And what Lewis notes about this project, and it is interesting, and it's also true of transhumanism of our day, he writes that the serious magical endeavor and the serious scientific endeavor are twins. Now, it sounds a little strange because when you think of science, you think of the realm of the rational, the skeptical, the objective, whereas magic is the remain of the dogmatic, the credulous, the superstitious. It's what the rationalist atheists accuse Christians of. You're just appealing to myths and stories and so forth. So in what sense does Lewis connect magic with science, and particularly transhumanism? Well, we can see that it runs through a number of Lewis's works. First of all, Uncle Andrew in The Magician's Nephew is a magician and a scientist. The conspirators in the National Institute of Coordinated Experiments, the NICE, in That Hideous Strength, they crave the powers of science and magic. They want Merlin. They are desperate to get Merlin on their side. And the purpose of this is to re-engineer society. And there are three important ways, and I'm getting this from John G. West, the Discovery Institute, in his sort of summary of this. Three ways in which they're similar. The first one is that they can function as an alternative religion. Both science and magic inspire wonder and mystery and awe. They have that in common. And scientism, those who are scientistic in the sense that they believe in science as a salvational branch, as it were. We can trust the science, believe in science, have something like reverence and awe, and also prohibitions against questioning or thinking or criticizing the science, which we saw very much laid out for us under COVID. You must not, don't you believe in science? And it wasn't a rational position, it was how dare you question. So how dare you think scientifically about science? Ask for evidence and proof and rationality and so forth. So that's the first point. The second point is that it offers a powerful alternative to traditional religion. And the promoter par excellence for this was H.G. Wells, which for those of you who did the sci-fi subcreation course with me, which most of you did, Wells and others fashioned Darwin's theory of evolution into a cosmic creation story. And Lewis called this variously, depending on the work. He called it the scientific outlook or evolutionism. He mentions that in the discarded image at the end. The myth of evolution, he even called it Wellsianity. What he notes here, which most evolutionists deny, is that Darwinian theory really presents a great story. And it's the story of a fight to the very end against the inevitability of destruction. It's a sort of thing that you see in Norse mythology as well. The Götterdämmerung at the end of all things. Ultimately, there'll be a struggle, and at the end, we will lose. Catastrophically, there will be a destruction of all things. That is there implicit in evolutionism, because remember, it's a survival of the fittest and all that. And Lewis thinks that actually this is a far more glorious narrative than you might think. It has a great deal of explanatory power to many people. And in a bleak and uncaring universe, the hero appears by chance on an insignificant planet to be fighting against astronomical odds, and everything seems to be against the infant hero of the drama, and yet in the end he fights the fight, and in the end he loses, however. But still, that struggle of that is magnificent. And he climbs his way, that is humanity, to the top of the animal kingdom, and he's going to go one step higher and become like the gods, and at that point it fails. Now, let me add one final thing on that note. the word transhumanism is used for the first time in 1957 by Julian Huxley. And Huxley saw it as man remaining man, but transcending himself. And I'm quoting here, by realizing new possibilities of and for his human nature. So Julian Huxley, who was the head of UNESCO, brother of Aldous Huxley, was an advocate of eugenics as a way of planning and plotting and controlling human evolution. And a friend of his was H.G. Wells. Now, H.G. Wells writes a work in 1923, a novel called Men Like Gods. And he imagines in the future a benevolent scientist, technicians who will use science and technology to manufacture a perfect future. A perfect future. And so the scene is set for an approach within the human sciences to attain the good, not in a Platonic or a religious or a properly humanist understanding, but as a practical extension of the capacities of that human beings have in their will and in their purposes, as an extension of their capabilities, understood in a materialist sense. So augmenting our physical strength or augmenting our life, the span of our lives. And that is very much being researched, studied, and promoted in the universities of our day, and has been for a very long time. So if you want to look up transhumanism, look at Silicon Valley and the universities in California, the elite universities in Stanford and Berkeley and you name it. You can find them in Oxford and Cambridge as well. You can find them in Europe. You can find them at the University of Toronto. The Transhumanist Project, which can also be advanced through AI, incidentally. If you want to know why all the money and talk is being pushed into AI, it's because AI is seen as an extension of the human, augmenting our capacities, extending them, making us be able to think at a more rapid and powerful and evolved state. And this is the threat of AI, say the humanists of AI, is that its capacities so far exceed ours that we're dispensable.
If you look up some of these headlines and the articles that they're putting out, it's the quest to build God and control humanity.
It's all there. It's all there.
Vision for AI,
yeah. What I'm saying is so evident, self-evident, and it's in the public square. It has been for quite a while now. Now there's almost nothing but it, and yet the conservatives and the evangelicals and whoever you want to name, whatever they fits under that conservative umbrella, don't talk about it as a problem. And that's because they're on board with it. Because they share the same view, more or less, of the human. Sadly. And we're going to have to come back to that view of the human, which is at stake here in the whole transhumanist project. But transhumanists seek approach to the good. And I say not in a Platonic sense like we saw last semester, not in a religious sense, and not even in a properly humanist sense at all, but as an extension simply of material capacities. And this is the application of science to human nature. And it's a long-standing project, but it really, I think, at least C.S. Lewis argues in his lecture De Descriptione Temporum, which I read in our Lewis class, and I'll do it again next year when I do C.S. Lewis again, in his inaugural or his maiden lecture at Cambridge University, when he's talking about the ages of literature, or looking at it in terms of ages or time periods, because his chairs that they've given him in Cambridge is medieval and Renaissance literature, and normally these are discrete areas and they don't mix at all. And in that lecture he disputes that there isn't more continuity between the medieval and the Renaissance period than discontinuity, and engages in all this. So then he's just looking at it and questioning the boundaries within literature there. And he says the real shift comes in twice. We go from the pagan era to the Christian era. There's a shift there, and it's genuine and it's significant. But there's a great deal of continuity there. There's still a sense of human nature, a rational human being, the pursuit of the good, the life of the mind, the life of the body politic, which we can see in the classical age, that continues on, carries on even by Christians. And so the question, what does Athens have to do with Jerusalem, is largely answered by the Christian tradition. It has a great deal to do with it, but that doesn't mean that the classical age is correct. We need to, as Augustine says, we need to plunder the Egyptians, and that will include our classical forebears, the Greeks and the Romans. We need to Christianize their thought. We don't need to reject it altogether. So there's a continuity there that goes, but there is a significant shift there, and particularly in what they mean by the good life. And furthermore, the end of human life, because in a Christian conception, we're made for God. We're not polytheists, and we're made for glory. And the weight of glory presses upon us and changes because of the incarnation. It transforms our view of human nature and the end of human nature, which is to be one with God. And but there's a significant shift there. There's another shift, and he says it's not between the medieval and the Renaissance. You can revisit his lecture if you want. I'm just summarizing it. It's in the mid-19th century when he says Darwinism starts monkeying with the origins of man, and Freud with the soul of man, and but in general, we turn the view of science against human nature for the first time. We apply it to human nature. Now, he says that's in the mid-19th century. On my course, I have suggested that actually that project begins back in the earlier 18th century when we start looking at language. Although he's correct about man, but he's not correct about language, and those two components are key here. It begins as a study of language, the origin of language and theories of language moving from emotive cries to articulated sounds and being able to reason about it. That begins in the early 18th century, and in my view, that's the beginning of evolutionism. It's evolutionism in language, evolutionism in reasoning, which then eventually gives way to a biological theory under Darwin in the mid-19th century. Lewis is correct insofar as he says that in the scientific realm, that's when a shift takes place. He's not correct insofar as it happens a century before in the area of language. So here's one area where I disagree with Mr. Lewis, and he would agree with me if I pointed this to him. I'm quite sure. I think he would. But in the mid-19th century, we look at human beings as something to be experimented on, to gain power over. And at that point, we dispense with the whole humanities tradition, because we dispense with the idea that man bears the image of God, has a certain sanctity and dignity that we can't mess with, that we must not treat as if it were an object or an animal or any material object, to a shift where we see man as merely the sum total of his capacities and functions in a very materialistic fashion. And what we do as a consequence of that is we dispense with the idea of human dignity, which even the pagans held. The pagans thought that human beings had dignity. In the Odyssey, one of Odysseus' companions has gone unburied, and he has to go back and bury him before they're allowed to carry on. When Achilles slays Hector and he drags him three times around the walls of Troy, even the gods are outraged at the treatment of a man here who's a hero. Why are they outraged? It's a funny thing, because they don't have the idea of the inherent dignity of human nature. It's that in both cases there's a sense of the sacred there, however. And Achilles is really threatening the gods with his sense that there's no value in anything except for his greatness. And in the end, it's actually the pleadings of Priam that sway Achilles to move away. And he says that here is great heroism in front of me. This man who lies at my feet, weeps, and pleads for his son, comes right in the middle of the enemy camp at risk of his own life, and Achilles lets him go. It's a huge, significant moment. All I'm trying to say with this is the pagans have a sense of human dignity as well. And that's the purpose of the cross, is precisely because it humiliates. It doesn't just kill. It's a slow acting killing thing. Yeah, okay. But it's way more than that. It's to humiliate. And the Jews were crucified naked because the Jews never went naked. Wouldn't bother the Greeks so much, or the Romans, but boy, does it ever bother the Jews. So we're going to add that here. The Jews will be crucified naked. Christ is crucified naked to humiliate him, to remove his dignity from him. And God permits this, which is another aspect of the cross, which is extraordinary. But in both cases, there's a sense of human dignity. In the pagan age, which they're trying to violate, the Romans are trying to violate that through the cross. And the Christians will double down on and apply to everyone everywhere. Not just Roman citizens will have dignity, but every human being bears the image of God. Not just your family, but strangers, children, women, slaves. These have human dignities. Why? Because they bear the image of God. Come the mid-19th century, there's a shift there when we look at human beings as something that we can study objectively, dispassionately, and as if the dignity of the person doesn't matter. Because all we're looking at is an animal that's evolved. That's all we're looking at, a more evolved form of animal. So all you need to get to agreement on this project is simply their consent, their informed consent to be subject to the experiment, the Nuremberg Code, right? That was the sole remaining ethical code that was recognized by the transhumanists until COVID hit, at which point they waived it, just like the Nazis did. The most alarming aspect of COVID-19 was that they had a code which they ridiculously enforced over the most silly, trivial experiments. In psychology, they ask you to fill out a form if you answer a questionnaire and it's being tabulated for data. You have to still sign your approval that you're being experimented on, and we have a research and ethics committee that will make sure that they follow certain guidelines. So it's taken very seriously. Under COVID, informed consent just gone. No university defended it. Medical scientists, medical professionals, doctors, scientists, whatever, looked the other way. It was not informed. It was coerced, and consent was not even required because they didn't believe in human freedom either. So, and one final note on this, which I think is important as a just pulling into the whole framework here, is that B.F. Skinner, the behaviorist psychologist, wrote a work, and I'll pull it up here. Beyond Freedom and Dignity. He writes this work. Ha! That's not going to work. There you go. You see it there anyway. Beyond Freedom and Dignity, in which he argues that the ideas of freedom and dignity are part of the humanist tradition, and we need to dispense with them because they stand in the way of a planned society and the manufacturing of a perfect future by means of science and technology. And he says that the chief defender of the tradition of freedom and dignity is none other than C.S. Lewis. In his works, he promotes the idea of human freedom as being important and human dignity as being something that must not be violated, or we forfeit the human altogether. And so he is targeted for this, and rightly so. I think he's correct in doing that. He could have added Tolkien to it, by the way, who does the same thing. But Lewis does so far more robustly and consistently and repeatedly in all his works. And against them is amassed the transhumanists. And as I say, it's first used by Julian Huxley in the UNESCO movement, but you can see it back in H.G. Wells and in science fiction, which again Lewis engages with in his sci-fi trilogy. But even in the early stages, we can see a mechanistic worldview rooted in the assumption that mere or more technology would solve humanity's problems and allow humanity to transcend itself. And despite not speaking with one voice, transhumanists are united in their focus on biotechnological enhancement and a techno-utopia of human-machine fusion that constitutes practical immortality. They're committed to this. And the reason why is because they have a certain view of human nature for which freedom and dignity are impediments. They're impediments to this project, holding on to this. So how do you advance a transhumanist agenda in education, in lit theory? First of all, you have to get people to question human nature. And secondly, you have to rob them or erode their sense of human dignity. And so when I said that when I wanted to do a Christian approach to literary theory, you have to emphasize the two things that are in the target hairs here. You have to promote a literature that has an understanding of human freedom and a view of human slavery, and fights for the one and fights against the other, and likewise of human dignity. That needs to be there in the literature that you have read in the schools. But the second thing, and it's at least as important, is the attack on human dignity. And that happens two ways. One that, again, the conservative and Christian community fully recognizes, which is in the experiments on human beings or the degradation of human life, which we see in euthanasia and abortion. Those things. So, or maybe I should flip it the other way, and abortion and euthanasia. And I think that it's important that both are happening, by the way, because what those express is a control over human life at the beginning and at the end. That's why they are there. And if you control it at the beginning and the end, and then that's considered ethical or scientifically possible or permissible or politically desirable, then what you're doing is furthering a transhumanist agenda, which is against freedom and dignity. So politics gets interwoven with the educational project. So that's the frontal assault, which everybody recognizes. And either you agree with that as a bad thing or you don't agree with it, but you see that there's an assault on human nature there. But there's a second way in which human dignity and freedom is assaulted, and that's the educational way. And it's not just in talking about abortion and euthanasia in schools. It's through a different way, which is actually through the categorizing of all knowledge as simply information. And here I wish I had my book with me, but I'll see if I can find the title here. And I'll just put it up on the screen. I must have left it at home. I carry it around with me. I actually have multiple copies, but there you go. Oh. Technopoly, The Surrender of Culture to Technology. That's not the book that I have.
I read that last year because you recommended it.
Good.
Sci-fi.
It's too small to be of use there. Do I got images? There I have. There we go. The approach of technopoly, the gist of it, the summary, very briefly, is that culture, which is the cultivation of human nature through education, and is part of the dominion mandate. Remember the dominion mandate in Genesis 1:26 to 28. And I'll throw it up here. Not Colossians 1, as much as I love that. Go to Genesis 1, and so many pop-ups, which I super hate. Go away. There we go. Then God said, let us make man in our own image, after our likeness, and let them have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the birds of the heavens, and over the livestock, and over all the earth, and over every creeping thing that creeps on the earth. So the three realms that he's talked about in Genesis 1 to 3, the sea, the land, the air, dominion over all those things. So God created man in his own image. In the image of God, he created him, the individual, male and female, he created them. The family, very important, too. There's plurality in the Godhead as well, as a consequence, sort of as many theologians have observed here. And the male and the female, part of being the image of God as well. These are not negotiable categories. They're not subjective to literary theories, strange views of language, and so forth. And God blessed them, and God said to them, and here's the dominion mandate, be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth and subdue it, and have dominion over and everything. Okay. And then I said to you, I think it was last time, that in the Genesis 1 narrative, God begins by subduing and then filling. So he subdues the elements, he separates them, he differentiates them, and then he fills them. Human beings do the exact opposite. It's a mirror image. They fill it and they subdue it thereby. Because by having children, you are able to cover the earth with people, and the people will use nature to glorify God in the right way. You're to make it better. That's part of the mandate. It's not dominate, it's not destroy, it's not regarded as a material thing, it's to regard it as God's handiwork and to treat it so, especially human beings. That's the dominion mandate. And absolutely essential to this. But when it comes to information then, and here's the problem in education, is that education has lost all sight of the importance of freedom and dignity. These two things have been lost sight of because they've lost the sense of human nature containing freedom and dignity, which is part of being made in the image of God. What does that mean? Exactly, what do I mean by this? What I mean by this is that the moral nature of man is no longer a goal of the education establishment. So the goal of education, as far as I'm concerned, or what education is its training in wisdom and virtue. This is not an equal, but I'll put an equal here anyway. Training it's implicit in the Shema in Deuteronomy 6. The whole of Deuteronomy, but really there, Shema, O Israel, Hear, O Israel, the Lord your God is one. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and soul and strength. You shall teach this to your children. You'll put it on the frontlets of your eyes and on your hands and on your doorposts and on the city gates. So it occupies your thoughts, it occupies your deeds, the things you do with your hands. So the intellectual life, the active life, if you will, the vita contemplativa, the vita activa, it governs the domestic sphere, it governs the civic sphere, the polis. That's what I think. So it's very holistic, and it comprehends the whole of the ancient world's sense of wisdom and paideia. They're coming from a Hebrew text. And if you want further corroboration of that, we'll then look to Ephesians 6 verse 4, where it talks about the paideia and nouthesia, and the word paideia at this point has, which he cites in Greek, has these holistic connotations of the Deuteronomy 6 injunction to parents to educate their children. But what you are doing them is training them in wisdom and virtue. You're teaching them what it means to be wise and good. The moral life is, in other words, in play or intended. You're treating them, your neighbor, well. You have a certain view of property. You have a certain view of dominion. You have a certain view of the law. You have a certain view of foreign relations. You have a certain view of everything. That comes directly from Scripture. And from the wisdom that is contained in Scripture and passed on. That's not just information. Wisdom is not information. Wisdom is a understanding of information. Whereas the modern educational approach is to